Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to give a warm welcome to all of you joining us today for the second day of our Design Impacts Global Summit, Following the Sun, Design Futures at the Intersection of Health, Equity, and Climate. This inspiring event, sponsored by the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council, unites our global community of practice, challenging us to use design as a tool for actionable, transformative change and healing. This series has brought together 48 global leaders to share their work and vision throughout 12 sessions and has reached an audience of over 2,000 people from 115 countries across the globe. Many people are responsible for today's event. I want to thank all my colleagues on the Alumni Council, each and every member of our session teams, our speakers from around the world, our event partners, the amazing team at EVIA, and finally, the faculty and staff of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Today, I invite you to follow the sun and reflect on each one's mission in this world, to think as you walk through each of our amazing sessions, what the challenges of today represent in the intersection of health, equity, and climate change. Our goal is to connect our global community of practice, establishing an infrastructure of innovation based on community, inspiration, and shared learning. I want to encourage every one of you, our wonderful audience, to focus on how design transcends regional and national boundaries, how innovation in design and technology can meet ancient or indigenous techniques and transform community-driven initiatives. We want to challenge each one of you to share our mission, make change happen through design. We need to look forward, but learning from the past. We need to design for inclusiveness and justice. We need to further our thinking and integrate nature in our design solutions and strengthen equitable community development. Let's design for positive impact. We need to act now and refine our approaches to preserve and regenerate our world, one action at a time. Today, it is my privilege to introduce to you the remarkable Anita Berrizbeitia. She is Professor of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. Her research focuses on design theories of modern and contemporary landscape architecture, the productive aspects of landscapes, and Latin American cities and landscapes. She was awarded the 2005-2006 Prince Charitable Trust Rome Prize Fellowship in Landscape Architecture. A native of Caracas, Venezuela, she studied architecture at the Universidad Simón Bolívar before receiving a BA from Wellesley College and an MLA from the GSD. Anita has taught design theory and studio, most recently at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, where she was Associate Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. Her studios investigate innovative approaches to the conceptualization of public space, especially on sites where urbanism, globalization, and local cultural conditions intersect. She also leads seminars that focus on significant transformations in landscape discourse over the last 3 decades. So with further ado, Anita, this is your stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the summit. For this meeting, I chose this beautiful image of the Gun Hole Garden behind me. I am not actually there as my backdrop to symbolize our return to campus this semester. Indeed, it has been very special for the GSD community to reunite after a year and a half of being apart. Needless to say, we're overjoyed, although curiously addressing these unforeseen but small problems we never imagined we would have. Like the students being unfamiliar with our place names in Gun Hole, the trays, the chow house, the lounges, the porticos, or the flat versus the steps of Piper. And the garden does not quite look so pastoral as it does in the image behind me. It is occupied with tents and lots of tables and chairs that serve as outdoor classrooms to reduce the risk of COVID infection. Amongst the many things we have had to relearn with the pandemic, and Walter Hood yesterday offered a wonderful description of how staying put forced him to stop and look around him. has been to realize how Gond Ho's architecture enables collaboration, community, and inspires and energizes us every day. In Gond Ho, we see design at work. But the pandemic also put a spotlight on landscape architecture in a way that caught us by surprise. We, of course, knew the fundamental importance of public open space for health and well-being, for environmental justice, and for climate adaptation, all topics that are central to our curriculum today. What we did not anticipate was the widespread acknowledgement of its value by literally everyone, from the press to civic and governmental leaders, to regular people who would have taken the landscape for granted. Even our own Gond Ho garden served as a place of gathering for the community, not just the students, a respite from the restrictions of the quarantine. Most of all, what was evident is how much design matters. And what do I mean by how much design matters? Many, many different fields that are not landscape architecture, in fact, transform the landscape, whether through agriculture, urbanization, forestry, civil engineering, conservation, transportation, and infrastructure, to name a few. And indeed, landscape was the thread of the conversation during day one of the Global Design Summit yesterday. But design, unlike those many other fields that act upon the land, uniquely offers a broader perspective, one that is able to articulate relationships that are latent or not understood, such that the built environment can do more for all of society and the ecosystems that sustain life on Earth. What is different now is that design enters into areas that were previously the specialized domains of others, such as civil engineers or agriculture, for example, and overlaps with regenerative, preservationist, and conservationist models and redefines them as we seek to expand their meaning. The work of our keynote speaker today, Everett, is a great example of landscape research in the largely uncharted territory of historic landscape designs and built by Black communities. Design also operates increasingly in realms that more traditionally have been associated with more quantitative approaches to the built environment, such as planning, or such as in regional or territorial scale landscapes or public health. To address climate change, we need to expand our frame of analysis and to understand large-scale landscape transformation over time, including how this change impacts ecosystems, economies, and the communities that live in them. A holistic and broad perspective is what we bring to the table that others do not. And it is also what gives us the vision and inspiration to imagine and implement transformative change, that is, to see design at work. Only then will we see its full potential unfold as it reconnects people, their cultures, their history, and memory to places and to the natural world in them, and witness the power of design as it works to regenerate, to repair, and to support the gardens, the cities, the regions, and territories of our future and shared commonwealth. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Everett, who will deliver the Day 2 opening keynote. A San Antonio native, Fly received his undergraduate degree in architecture at the University of Texas, Austin, where he graduated with honors. And in 1977, he became the first African-American graduate in landscape architecture here at the GSD. The core achievement of Everett Fly's distinctive career has been the development of a database, an archive of places and landmarks designed by Black Americans. This database, an archive of 1,200 sites and counting, goes back to the early colonial period and includes historic Black settlements, places of burials, churches, productive and pleasure gardens, streets and agricultural landscapes. In other words, all the landscapes where the daily lives and rituals of Black peoples and their communities took place during and after enslavement. Earlier, I spoke of why and how design matters. And this is also a point Everett's work demonstrates. And I quote here from one of his writings. Black landscape designers and gardeners, he states, have been present in America since the colonial days of this nation, whether formally or informally trained in gardening, horticultural, and management techniques. Once Black Americans began to own land, gardens and landscapes became purposeful elements of their environment, and evidence of their history exists throughout the United States. Moreover, Fly argues that although the tangible artifacts of architecture are too often utilized as the primary indicator to establish the historical importance of a town, it is the landscape that is often the most significant resource in a community and therefore the greater emblem of its culture. This extraordinary contribution to the history of this country and to our discipline has been not only sustained over a long period of time, 4 decades of his work, but it has also been painstaking and laborious. Everett Fly was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, where he served from 1994 to 2001. In 2014, President Barack Obama recognized him with the National Humanities Medal, an honor rarely given to architects or landscape architects. He has received several awards for his preservation work, has been a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects since 1995, and is a co-founder of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. And I might also add that this year he received the Alumni Achievement Award from the GSD. We are honored to have such a distinguished landscape architect and alumnus at the GSD speak today in our summit. Please join me in welcoming Everett Fly.
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction, and thank everyone in all parts of the world who are participating in this really exciting and innovative summit. I know you're anxious to get to the presentations that follow this, and I promise not to take too much time, but again, I want to emphasize how significant this is, as Anita has so eloquently stated, and the presenters yesterday stated. My assignment today is, as you heard Anita say, is to challenge you to use design as a tool for actionable, transformative change and healing at the intersection of health, climate change, and equity. And of course, if you look at your dictionaries, you'll see that transformative means causing a marked change in someone or something. And that's something I believe very deeply in. Of course, the term dynamic is meant to address change. Of course, change is natural, but no matter where you live in the world, we are seeing change and impacts in all aspects of the environment in our life on a global scale. Changes that we could not imagine a decade ago, much less 2 years ago. As planners and designers, we must change with the times, not simply to maintain the status quo or be followers, but to be effective leaders. We should not depend on traditional agents or themes of change. Again, if we look objectively and honestly at all the world around us, it is evident that the traditional actors cannot do what planners, designers, and landscape architects do. Traditional rigid design and thought will no longer be effective in the everyday scenario, especially those that are transformative. Real and lasting change takes time, often years. Patience, do you want to win the battle or do you want to win the war? And it comes with certain amounts of pain. And sometimes pain is good. Persistence on multiple fronts, optimism, healthy and positive, and creativity. Constantly thinking outside of the box and constantly thinking in an original and creative way. I use the analogy of the artist palette in my title. The palette is a noun. There are several ways that the term can be used, but I prefer the definition that says a comparable range, quality, or use of available elements. The artist palette image seems to work pretty well because it can apply to other disciplines, music, computing, design, even computer technology. The palette elements that I want to encourage you to think about, of course, include design, the planning, the programming, the design phases, the technical phases, the implementation that we're all used to seeing and working with. But I want to call your attention to the humanities. The humanities would be your link to culture and historical context and perspective. History, including urban, architectural, and landscape architectural, archaeology, anthropology, literature, law, languages, religion. These are all elements and disciplines that would greatly add to your work and give it additional depth. Of course, looking at these humanities disciplines and working with them means that your approach and your process must be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, including even politics. One other thing that you might not consider, and it's been alluded to, Walter Hood alluded to it, Anita just talked about it in her introduction, is the personal or people interaction. Wherever you work and seek to advance change, I think it's important to find people with the deepest roots in the community. This is particularly important when working with indigenous and minority communities. A lot of times these resources and information are not in our traditional archival documents. And so that means you have to sit down, you might have to do an oral history, you might have to do a dozen oral histories and meetings. And I know that that's time consuming, but that's the link, that's the source, that's the most authoritative resource for your work. And of course, you want to work with organizations that have broad missions within the community. Your tools, which the design professions and landscape architects have command of, give the voice and the advocacy to your work and your projects. Applied knowledge, of course, is practical knowledge that it's produced by putting your academic training into work, into practice. But applied knowledge grows as your experience grows. And you try things, that creative approach and problem solving, you try things in the real world situation. When I was coming along, I know many of you have heard this as well, but when I was coming along, folks would say, well, you need some real world experience. And that's really true today. The current real world experience is even more complex, and it literally changes by the second. I believe that the tools that the designers, the landscape architects have, the ability to develop multi-level compositions and vision are extremely important. Whether you're working with a technical issue, whether you're working with a building code or a regulation, a planning code, your vision for community advancement and change will be important. Sometimes you have to look at those codes and regulations, so to speak, inside out, but it's possible to use them, leverage them to your benefit to get your desired result. The process a lot of times is organic or hybrid. I know with all the things that are going on, we have a tendency to simply want to find a template and tack it on to what we're doing and go on. But real change takes this hybrid and cross-reference approach. Think about what I said a moment ago about the humanities. Whether you're working with at a student level, a teacher level, or an academic level, there are things and ways that you can do. You can expand your knowledge base. If you're teaching, as Anita does and others, you can find examples that your students can learn from and at least get a taste before they get out and get into the real world. If you're a practitioner, you might have some challenges because you're used to doing things in a certain way. But if you can add that humanities approach, that humanities component to your regular technical and programming and design process, you'll be amazed at how deeply the result is, the impact of the result in your final design. Yesterday, I had the great pleasure to listen in on session 7, Power, Equity, Memory, Erasure, Memorials in the Making of Historic Narrative. I listened to a very good and thought-provoking discussion which highlighted the power of the landscape. For centuries, indigenous and minority groups, minority religious and ethnic group populations have been physically forced from their homelands and forced to live in dangerous and unhealthy landscapes. The resulting emotional and civic damages are deep, and for many of us, they are unimaginable. The community self-esteem has even been destroyed in an unimaginable way. So there's a great need for healing in whatever you do. Again, the work that you would do, talking to individuals and talking to people in the community will go a long way, and you will be amazed at the information that they share, not only about the current history or current thoughts, but about the rituals and the traditions and the customs in the landscape. I'd like to kind of wrap this up, my brief comments again by asking you to think about how deeply embedded our cultures and history are in the landscape. This has been one of the greatest lessons for me, is learning about the embedded cultures. Sometimes they're very subtle, but that means that they're very fragile. It also means that they have roots in the basic issues, whether it's environment, community health, public health, even aesthetic quality. And the aesthetics may seem simple, but they all count, and they make the composition of the world and the landscape that we live in so interesting and so beneficial. So as you go forward today in listening to the different sessions, think about those things that I've mentioned, especially the humanities. And I would look forward to engage any questions or discussion in the Q&A right after this about that. It's such a broad area, a rich and fertile area, that I couldn't go through it discipline by discipline. But essentially all those that I read to you in that humanities list, I've used many times and reused many times. And it's been amazing how they've affected the outcomes in the different projects. So thank you again for this opportunity. And I would look forward to addressing any of your questions and comments and discussion. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Everett. That was very well said. And I look forward to exploring, hopefully in the Q&A that follows now, this forceful idea you pose about the importance of the humanities. because we are in a world with such crises that are always being defined through scientific research, and so we must not forget of our roots in the humanities in the design fields as well. So I have actually several questions already for you. So we'll just start right away.
Sure.
The first one is what were your key learnings from your work on the Black Settlements Project?
Well, I guess the first thing was how much planning and development had been done. As you mentioned in the introduction, how much planning and development had been done by African Americans and minority groups that was simply overlooked. We didn't see or hear about these achievements or accomplishments or communities in any of the history books. And I found myself in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives many years ago. And the archivist introduced me to documents that clearly documented the existence of an African-American settlement in what is now known as Arlington National Cemetery. That settlement was called Friedmans Village. And the documents in the archives, you might call them coincidental. They were kept in an Army records group, the quartermaster's records to be exact, but they included drawings of a colored orphanage, drawings of a colored church, even the layout of the community, and then text records documenting the names of the African Americans that lived there. And so once I found that and found out that community was related to one of our country's most prestigious and sacred landscapes, then I knew that there was a job to be done, and whatever I could do to advance that and expose that, that's what I wanted to do.
Thanks, Everett. What a wonderful experience that must have been to be in those archives, seeing the material anew. The second question, what do you think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the future of landscape architecture education?
Well, my first thought right off the top is it's long past due. As you know, Anita, and you stated in your introduction, when I was at the GSD, you could count the number of Black students on your hands. And we would get together, even the African American planning students, we would get together and try to figure out what we could do to encourage more African Americans to be involved in the planning and landscape architecture disciplines, and what could we do as at that point as up and coming planners and designers. So to see young African Americans and people of color raising their voices, raising their awareness to these issues, it's really exciting, and I'm glad to see it coming. And I hope that we'll be able to encourage more people of color, more religious diversity, gender diversity, et cetera, in the profession, because it only goes to help us all.
Well said. And here's another question related to education. How do you see that this integration of the humanities should transform how we think of design education?
Well, one real quick story. I had the great pleasure and honor to serve 11 years in Texas on the State Humanities Council. I was nominated by a history professor that I knew, and I remember my first meeting at the State Humanities Council, and kind of during the reception time, one of the members came up to me and said, what's a landscape architect doing on the State Humanities Board? why aren't you on the Arts Council? And kind of took me off guard, but my response was that, at that point I had done quite a bit of work with, in the arts, and had quite a bit of that in my education, my formal education. And the State Humanities Council really gave me a chance to see grassroots work. You heard me in my introduction talk about applied knowledge, the work that the Humanities Council do, and a lot of the work that the National Endowment for the Humanities does is applied humanities work. In other words, working with communities for them to, whatever the theme of the program is, whether it's the philosophy or anthropology or archaeology or history, working with the communities to highlight that and expose that, in the places where they live and occur. So for a landscape architect or a landscape architecture student to be exposed to that, it simply broadens your perspective. It broadens your command of disciplines to apply to whatever your work is, whether it's research or a project. I mean, think about it. If you're doing a project and you want to really include some icons or images or symbols or whatever, in your work that relate to the community, the humanities is your link to that. And it will only make your work more authoritative, more informed, and I think it would give you a better quality design.
Okay, next question. What have been the biggest impacts of your work?
Well, interesting, when I started, kind of my assumption was that I would work on one site at a time or one building at a time. And by working on the settlements, it meant that the research of the settlements, it meant that I was dealing with a whole community. And almost before I could finish my academic work at the School of Design, I was approached by communities, people in communities. And so that was the beginning of my work with whole communities, not just one building or one site at a time. And came to discover that these communities, communities of color and African-American communities in the United States particularly, are in desperate need for consultation, advice, guidance, planning work, design work. And I've had the good fortune and blessing to get to work with several of these communities now for several decades. And so I just never imagined in the beginning that that my work would impact a whole community. And a few years ago, I had a chance to work with 5 African-American towns and settlements at once. And that was like another education, but it also gave me a chance to help them as a group.
What a marvelous experience to have that sustained engagement over decades.
Yes, and again, that's
rare.
That's right. That's where my comment about it might take years. So for the audience to be aware of that, because there's so much work to be done, and a lot of the background information that you would need is not already at hand. You might find yourself being the creator, co-creator, collaborator to begin to build the background information that you need.
Next question. Can you give us some reflections on the importance of landscape architecture at this moment?
Well, I'm like everyone else. I'm simply amazed at as you look at the news reports and so forth from around the world, the environmental issues, the environmental events, some of them disasters, the social movements and of people from not only one city or town to another, but from one continent to another. And I'm so grateful that I'm a landscape architect, because I can just begin to understand, just begin to wrap my head around, the impacts of those things, and think about how can we collectively, societies, cultures, how could we collectively work together, especially with landscape architects, to address those issues. So it might seem scary, frightening at this point, but the tools, the training, the environmental training, the large-scale planning and analysis training and experience that landscape architects have, I can't imagine another time where it's more valuable.
And do you see any risks in the present moment, or do you see opportunities more than anything else? And what would those be for design and for landscape architecture in particular?
Sure. Well, I think I see both. Again, as I just noted, all the things that are going on in the world, there's certainly opportunities for landscape architects, and even opportunities that we may not have even begun to imagine. One of the concerns, risks I have is that in some cases, these cultures and groups and communities are so desperate for and need help and assistance and guiding and planning and solutions that we might rush in some cases for a quick solution. And sometimes we do need quick solutions, but they might be temporary, but we just need to be careful so that we don't land on something and then say, oh, that's the long-term solution, because as you know, and our audience knows, community planning is extremely complex, and there's all kinds of dynamics at work. And but if we have good interdisciplinary teams, good culturally diverse teams, I think that again there's opportunities to deal with the pressures of needing quick solutions, but we can develop a whole succession, a whole strategy to address these problems.
Is that tension between the immediate need and the short term, but that may not be a long-term solution, discussed yes. in the context of these interdisciplinary collaborative teams? How is that decision arrived at? What are the conflicts there? Because I can imagine how that would be an incredible source of contention, right? The immediate need for a resolution of a crisis versus what resources are being devoted or spent in longer term smarter.
Right. Yes. And again, that's where I see landscape architects being particularly well suited for leadership roles, because they can help the coalition, so to speak, of decision makers. They can help them, landscape architects can help them understand kind of the succession of steps, but provide kind of a quality and professional guidance. Landscape architects are used to managing teams to actually build landscapes. And so I think they could even be managers and leaders for those decisions. But you're absolutely right. The tensions, the term you use is very good. The tensions are sometimes enormous. And as I mentioned in my comments, they can be painful. But again, I think the landscape architects have the vision and the type of problem-solving skills that they can help not just the decision makers, but help the public, help the communities understand. And a lot of times that's where an additional tension point is that the community is not included in that discussion. The community, especially in minority communities, they're told that some higher level of decision maker will decide for you. But again, I think that landscape architects have the abilities to, how they say, get down there in the grassroots and work with those groups and work with those organizations. That's why I mentioned, and I kind of went through it quickly, but if you can build a relationship with some of the knowledgeable people in the community, that can be a big help, not only for, say, like historical information, but the networking, the kind of networking, community networking that you need, and pull that together with the whether it's municipal decision makers or corporate decision makers or otherwise, you can pull that together, and the landscape architects can help pull that together and kind of reach more balanced solutions and problem-solving methodologies.
How do you build the trust that you would need to get that kind of credibility with
well,
the communities?
That's a very insightful question, and I try to explain that with whomever I work with. Is, in my projects, I really look forward to going directly to those community people, not just in a big open meeting, but a lot of times it's one-on-one. And again, it takes time, and we have the challenges today with social distancing and not being able to get to everybody, but even if it's a phone call or a series of phone calls. But in the past, that's what I would do, is go directly to those community leaders, those trusted community spokespeople, and just sit down with them in their landscape, in their place, and talk about what their goals were, what their visions were, help them to see the value in their place and landscape and culture, and just work that way. I can't understate how important that community trust is. And in many cases, in many of my projects with ethnic groups, indigenous groups, African Americans, that community trust is more important than anything.
And as you have clearly built this extraordinary credibility and trust amongst all of the communities that you worked with, how has your work changed your understanding of yourself as not only as a landscape architect, but as an American?
Well, as I mentioned, when I started, I was thinking I would work one place or one site, one landscape at a time. But I've learned or come to see that I have more vision. I've developed more vision in my methodology and my strategies, and my approach than when I started. And also that's given me confidence, for example, to actually work with the whole community. So if I get a call or a request from a community, it is a challenge, but I have confidence now that it can be addressed, that we can find positive solutions, we can build healthy process, and that notion of healing. I've learned how much healing power there is in that process of working with community and working with people. And so that's why when I talk to my clients who happen to be architects, or when I talk to architects that I'm collaborating with, I work really hard for them to understand how important that healing aspect will be in the work that they do and the designs that they come up with.
I love that idea that healing is a result of design.
Yes.
It's not just the physical space or the qualitative aspects of the space, but healing is
exactly.
way of seeing design at work.
Right. Yeah, I've had folks in communities say that, they never thought that anybody would ever pay attention to whatever it is, their town, their cemetery, their school, their church, and to just see them see the energy and the joy, when you actually start working with them for whatever the project is. It's really, again, back to the terminology of the sessions, it's really transformative.
So when you get these calls out of the blue from a community saying, we need help, we need you to come over here and get something started. And I assume you've gotten many of these over the years. Which has been the hardest, let's say, process to overcome, or the hardest and most difficult? I mean, have you failed in any of these, and why? You speak about growing more confident in your ability to, in fact, achieve resolution in design, a way forward, and the healing that goes with it. Where, in which of these experiences have you found the greatest obstacles, and what have they been? Is it economic? Is it social? Is it political? What is the greatest obstacle that you find?
Several good pieces in that question. I suppose there's one point of view that says, even if you don't reach your original goal, some folks would say, well, you failed. But if you learn something from that experience or process, I personally don't see it as a complete failure. I mean, we've had projects, people that have approached us, and this is why I mentioned, having short-term goals versus long-term goals. I've had some folks call and they say, well, we want this fixed right now. And sometimes they have a budget and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the budget is not enough. And so how do you explain to them that you really want to work with them, but realistically, they don't have enough, in the budget? So the other part of your question that I want to quickly touch on is the challenges. It's kind of two parts. My observation is, when I say political, it's most of the minority communities and ethnic communities are not, today we would say they're not empowered in government. In other words, if it's not a Black town that is incorporated, where they can elect their own mayor, they can elect and appoint the fire chief, they can elect and appoint the police chief. If it's not a community like that, then they have to work within the county government or the city government or whatever. And until Black Lives Matter, the last few years, a lot of the large government entities weren't sensitive to those needs and issues of those minority communities. They are catching on, and some are simply jumping on the bandwagon just for appearance's sake. But that political challenge is really big, and you've already heard me mention the economic challenges, but those seem to be, from my experiences, the two biggest ones. Is how do you work through that political system? How do you build enough leverage to get the political decision makers to work with you, to cooperate, to collaborate? And that's where, in my comments, that's what I was getting at when I said you have to think outside the box. Sometimes you have to find other networks that can get the message across, or other networks that can actually influence some of those decision makers or other sources of funding. If the county doesn't have funds or the city doesn't have funds, is there a philanthropic organization? Is there a foundation? And again, we're seeing the foundations and philanthropic groups respond to things that we're seeing with, Black Lives Matter, social issues, that kind of thing.
That's fascinating. When there is there seems to be, or if I'm understanding you correctly, there's a kind of void in the governance or a void in the political system that would vie for the interest of these communities, and how to, in a way, circumvent that in the reality that there isn't representation.
Yes.
In that sense.
Yes.
Then who becomes the representation?
Who becomes the,
yeah.
Right. And so sometimes, again, going back to the theme of the symposium, sometimes the landscape architect or the planner has to be like walking a tightrope, be the advocate for your community or the community you're working with, not aggravating the political decision makers, because you might have to come back and work with them again.
So, a second byproduct, first byproduct, healing, second byproduct, politics.
Yes, yes.
You are the advocate. You are the person that through advocacy directly with the political systems that may or may be there, may not be there in a strong way.
Yes, right.
And the foundations you argue for these to make these things possible.
Exactly. Yes.
I understand now why you say it's slow and it requires patience.
Right.
But it requires patience from your communities too. I mean, you have to in a way train them into patience, right? When they
educate or enlighten or inform them and help them find ways to make progress towards the bigger goal. Because every step counts with these communities. Every step has a benefit, and a lot of times it's things that you don't expect. But being creative, once you get a positive sidebar, you can pick up on that and say, oh, we can grow that too, or we can expand that too, and tie it into the bigger project. That's why I say that all communities, irregardless of ethnicity, are complex, and that's where the organic approach and organic thought comes in.
Is there a project that you are especially satisfied with? What has been your biggest success?
Well, I guess the one that I would say I'm especially satisfied with is being able to work for more than 30 years with Eatonville, Florida. And Eatonville sits just on the north side of Orlando, Florida. It's an all-Black town, incorporated in 1898, 1899, and population of a little bit less than 3,000 people. And they were challenged, actually threatened, in the late 1980s by a county road project. And the road project would have divided the town in half, simply cut it in half. But the town didn't have an in-house planner or landscape architect or civil engineer to help them understand was there anything they could do. And of course, it turned out the history of the town was the real asset. The fact that it was established that far back, 100 years back, and also Eatonville was the childhood home of Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American Harlem Renaissance writer. Their eyes were watching God, mules and men, etc. And so we used Zora. Well, here we go to the humanities. We used the reference to Zora as the historical leverage point that the road would cut Zora's town in half, and the new road would actually destroy the traces of one of the landmarks in Zora's books. The road Dust Tracks on the Road was one of Zora's books. So I've been able to work with them for 30 years, and that's pretty amazing just in itself.
Have you documented this in a book, or will this be published at some point? It would be wonderful to see the history of this 30-year design project and its impact on this historic town.
Well, that would actually, that's kind of the next thing, Anita, on my list, is to do some writing. And that's something I'm looking forward to, is writing about Eatonville as well as some of these other cases, because they are unique, and they would be important for the communities as well as the larger landscape architecture and design community.
Everett, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak and see what you're up to. And I will pass it on to Adriana once again for the next steps.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Everett.
Thank you so much, Anita and Everett, for such an enlightening, relevant, and deep conversation you just shared with us this morning. I am certain our audience and students leave this session with solid inspiration, challenged to transform our spatial experiences into healing landscapes.